video live streamed? You guys got that? Is this okay? Purple? Well, so I don't know. I mean, don't you want it online where people can listen this morning? Not this morning. Okay. All right. So I need to use the mic then. Okay. Okay, we're gonna go ahead and get started. Mic is mic'd. Okay, I'm gonna use the mic this morning. I don't think it's actually gonna be live streamed, but they're recording it, so should be good. Good morning. Everybody's here this morning. See a few new faces, so that's good. Come here to have a Bible study. So, who remembers what we're talking about these series of weeks? There we go. Yeah, and more specifically, the Beatitudes. Come on, Joe. So great. So some of it, for the folks that haven't been here, actually let me start a little clock here so I don't go too far. Okay. Well, when we're reading on the Beatitudes, some of the background, I'll just keep in mind. This was a sermon that we're mainly focused in Matthew here. It was placed at the beginning of Matthew's gospel, at the beginning of Jesus' Galilean ministry, probably because of the importance of how he felt like it was laying a foundation for everything else that Jesus taught. And so this series here in March, we're going through the Beatitudes, which is essentially, I think we're basically going down through verse 16. And so today we're going to be reading verse 7 of chapter 5, Matthew, down through verse 11. And so let's just start off by reading that. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil things against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. And so the Beatitudes, it's interesting. This is really the attitude that we're supposed to have. That's the label. Jesus really never used the term, but it's just more of a label from the translators. But it does, maybe a different way to look at it as mindsets. What kind of a mindset should we have? And that's probably an easier way to think of it. But I want to just take a look at some general observations of this, for one thing. One thing I think that it's interesting is that each one of these offers a reward. And so I want to ask you, is it okay to be rewarded for what we do? People okay, Kevin likes to be rewarded, absolutely. Yeah, I like to get paid. Is that selfish? Yes. It's very selfish. Is it a sin? No, it's not. Who wants to go to heaven here? Lift your hands up in the air. Okay, you want to go to heaven. Is that selfish? Is it a sin? No. No, it's not. That's not a sin. All through the Bible, God appeals to our desires for rewards. He doesn't condemn it. It's a longing that he put inside of us, and it's righteous. And that's a sermon for a whole nother time. But rewards are part of God's plan. We shouldn't feel bad about wanting to be rewarded. And many of the things, all through the scriptures, all through the Gospels, when Jesus says something, he says, if you do this, there are going to be good things that happen. And we should want those rewards. So studying in the Bible, what is a sin and what's not with respect to selfish desires. I think what you'll find is there's no place in the Bible that God condemns selfishness in its purest form. So we can talk about that more some other time. Rewards in the Beatitudes are both in this life and in the future. So I think you could apply this to rewards in heaven. He says, blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Certainly that is true in heaven. But is it true in this life? And the thing that I'd have you think about today in the Beatitudes, I think really this sermon is more meant to be able to deal with how we apply this in this life. And there's certainly another application of it too. But let's think about today how we're going to be blessed in this life. So, in Jesus, it's interesting, in Matthew chapter 7, he kind of sums up this whole sermon with basically this. He says, so in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you. This sums up the law and the prophets. And so in this, this kind of goes back to what we talked about in the first thing as far as some of the background and all of that with the Beatitudes. But this is, this kind of sums up, the law and the prophets. So the Old Testament, a lot of the Jews, the audience of the day, they had a particular identity, right? They were an occupied nation. They had the Romans that were over them. They had a Jewish tradition based in the Old Testament, and they had a particular perspective of what it meant to please God or please their Father. And this was meant to be a reframing, maybe a paradigm shift of not abolishing the law, because the law helped us understand what's right and wrong, right? That's essential. But this helped them think differently about what does it really mean to please my Father. So when we talk about the Beatitudes, this word blessed, some translators will look at it and say if you literally translated that, it's more literally translated bliss, or specifically, oh, the bliss of. Oh, the bliss of the poor in spirit, which I think that one's kind of an interesting one. You might look at it and say at first glance when somebody would read through this, oh, the bliss of all these horrible things. You might say, well, what kind of a mentally disturbed, masochistic type person would think that this is actually true, at first glance. Happy when we're persecuted, happy when we're insulted, when people say evil stuff about us. Oh, the bliss of that. All of us want that in our life, right? Last week we talked about one, and I think this one's a good example, and it leads into the ones we're going to talk about today. But he says, blessed are the poor in spirit, meaning poor, completely destitute. Financially destitute, is that blessed? Most times we say, no, that's not a blessed situation. But what about spiritually destitute? Is that a blessed situation, that we should be spiritually destitute? But I think the point is that if our mindset is that there is this huge gap in our spirituality, what do we want more than anything else? Spirituality. We long to have that gap fulfilled, and that's a blessed attitude. If we hunger and thirst for righteousness, we can't get enough righteousness. I've got a hunger for it. Jesus says that's a blessed place to be. So these attitudes are really from a position of strength, a security in our identity, our self-worth in the eyes of God, our Father in heaven. And therefore, we could choose to recognize what's going on around us and respond appropriately without being enslaved by the opinions of others or just simply beat ourselves down. So what is he actually saying? Let's look at Matthew chapter 7, verse 5. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. And it's kind of, in this world, it's kind of what comes around goes around, right? If you bless somebody else, they're going to bless you. If you're merciful to other people, we're going to be given mercy as well. And of course, we want this from God, and we want this from other people. We're all going to need mercy at some point in time, right? So just kind of a side point, I think with the term mercy, sometimes this is one of the words sometimes people misapply or they misuse. Sometimes it's used interchangeably with grace, forgiveness, and sometimes used incorrectly. So just as a definition standpoint, when we think about grace, some people will say, well, I gave them grace. Well, what's that really mean? Grace is probably more clearly understood the way it's translated. The old Hebrew word in the Old Testament is translated, and most commonly in the Old Testament, as God's favor, right? Or you could think of it as God's favor to us, or we're his favorite, right? So if we are God's favorite, out of that grace to us, if you think of a child and they're your favorite, maybe we don't pick favorites with kids, but it's you want to, you're gonna. There's a lot of good things that are gonna happen. There's gonna be mercy. There's gonna be forgiveness and things like that. Forgiveness. Sometimes people will say, "Well, he was wrong. He wronged me in some way, but I gave him grace." No, you didn't give him grace. You gave him forgiveness. And how much more courage does it take to say, "I forgive you"? Because we're admitting that, no, you screwed up, and I forgive you. As far as the east is from the west, the offenses are forgiven. That's the way God treats us. That's forgiveness. But it comes out of grace. And the love, if you love someone, there's going to be grace. Out of that will be forgiveness, but also mercy. Mercy is simply seeing somebody in need, and our heart is moved to do something to relieve that suffering. So blessed are the merciful. We see that, and our heart is moved. In John chapter 1, verse 3, you can read over there. I'm going to reference a bunch of scriptures, and you guys can go back and read this. Again, I think the intent of this class is to give you guys ideas. And in the spirit of the Bereans in the book of Acts, to be able to go back and study it out for yourself. Come to your own conclusions. Study and see if what Paul said was true, is what they did. It's the intent of this class. In John chapter 3, verse 1, verse 17, it says, "If anyone has material possessions and sees a brother in need but has no pity on him, how can the love of God be in him?" So if you have somebody who sees a need and feels nothing, and there's no pity or mercy, there's a bit of a disconnection from reality. How are we really, if we've adapted the heart of love, we're going to feel something, right, if we see somebody else in need. So in this case, John suggests that we're moved to do something physically to meet the need. There's other times when we're going to see somebody's need around us, and the opposite may be true. So like with Paul, he said, if a man shall not work, a man shall not eat, in the book of Corinthians. So the idea is that the response may be different, but we're moved to meet the needs of people. We see it around us. So give some good examples. In Luke chapter 10, verse 30, I won't read it. It's the story of the Good Samaritan, right? Jesus gives an example of a man who was traveling along the road, was beat up by robbers. A couple of people, religious people, goes in front, and they kind of look the other way. They move on. But a Samaritan, who was looked down on in that culture, stopped and helped the guy. And Jesus said, who was it? Was his neighbor? And the man said, the person that showed him mercy, right? So he noticed a need, and he saw that, he took notice of it, and it moved him to do something different. Then there was the mercy. Another example was the unmerciful servant. In Matthew chapter 18, verse 21, you go back and read that. This guy got a big debt forgiven that he could never repay. And so then once he was set free from that debt, he also went to somebody else and was unwilling to forgive their debt. I mean, he should have been keenly aware of the stress, the fear that was there by being unable to pay his debt, as well as the peace and the freedom and the gratitude that resulted from having that forgiven and being shown mercy. But he chose to translate that same experience in not to do that for somebody else. So sometimes it's that power. Why wouldn't he do that? I think that's the thing when I read that scripture. Why would somebody in that situation not translate that towards somebody else? The application, guys, is the same thing. We have been forgiven. Yet, do we ever struggle with mercy towards somebody else? I mean, that's really the root of unforgiveness, right? And so, why didn't he make that connection to someone else? I mean, sometimes it's power, authority, greed, other things like that, insecurity. These sort of things produce harshness in relationships and is opposite of the heart of God. But mercy really is based in the principle of cause and effect. In Galatians chapter 6, verse 7, he says, "Do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows." If you're merciful, you'll be merciful to, if you're merciful to others, you're going to receive it from others around you that you do life with, but then also from your Father in heaven. But this comes really from a result of becoming more like our Father in heaven. So in Matthew chapter 8, that's merciful. Be merciful, and you're going to get mercy too. Let's look at the next one, Matthew chapter 8. 5, verse 8. "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God." Same deal. We're all going to see God at some point in time. And for some of us, that's going to be a glorious situation. For others in this life, it won't be. But we will all see God. I think he's more specifically talking about seeing the actions of God in our life today. And I would probably use the term authentic. People who are authentic might be the people that would be more likely to see the working of God around us. You know, who is it? Let me just ask you this. As you go through the Gospels and you read the Gospels, there were some people that saw God in the Messiah of Jesus, and some people didn't. I want you to ask yourself, who was it that saw God? Who was it that saw the Messiah when they saw Jesus? And who didn't recognize him? And why? Then you could ask yourself, when are those situations where I just feel like God's not working around me? I can't see God doing anything in my life. And there's the other times where you say, God is definitely working in my life. What's the difference in spirit? Maybe where do we need to apply this attitude? Blessed are the pure in heart. Those who focus on comparison with other men typically missed Jesus, specifically the Pharisees. The people that were caught up in comparison, position, their authority, their recognition, the good opinion of men around them, they typically missed Jesus. Those who simply wanted blessing or to know the truth tended to recognize him. There's a whole sermon in most of these Beatitudes. Look at some examples. Matthew chapter 5, these are just examples out of Matthew chapter 5. I'm just going to refer to them, but go back and look at them yourself. Chapter 8, verse 5, the centurion. At this point in time, this guy was the greatest faith that Jesus had ever seen at that point in time. And he was really impressed about how this guy understood authority. He was impressed about how he understood Jesus' authority. He says, I'm a man under authority, but you're a man under authority. He recognized Jesus in this way. You just say the word. Matthew chapter 9, verse 1 through 8. The Pharisees, who loved authority, could not see his authority and demanded signs for his authority. Matthew chapter 9, verse 18, there was a woman that was healed. She just knew his ability. I mean, there was a purity of heart. There was a low station. And they weren't trying to be something. They didn't have to compare themselves to anybody else. They were just realized they were kind of at the bottom of the barrel. And that's why the tax collectors and the sinners and the prostitutes were entering the kingdom of heaven before the Pharisees. Because that comparison was not there. There was a humility of mind, a connectedness with the reality of who they were. Enabled them to actually really see what was going on. They would say, like in Matthew chapter 9, verse 27, this beggar alongside the road, he called him Son of David, or Lord, Son of David. You would see these guys respond in that way because they recognized him. There was a humility and purity of heart that was there. In Matthew chapter 16, verse 1, the Pharisees demanded evidence for his authority and focused on comparison with men, and they simply missed Jesus. So it seems that those who didn't put their faith in position and authority were readily able to see the hand of God working in their life. So I think sometimes we got to think about it as like, do I measure myself more about how I compare with everybody else? Or am I really measuring myself by my relationship with God? All these things weren't meant to be legalistic like in the Old Testament. They were meant to be all about relationship. And what Jesus' whole point of his ministry was restoring relationship. Number one, ours with the Father. Right? That was what he was here to do. So as you read through the Gospels, take a look at who recognized him as Messiah and who didn't, and ask yourself why. Okay, let's look at the next one. Matthew chapter 5, verse 9. Blessed are the peacemakers. They will be called sons of God. And I would just add on to that, these are people that restore relationships, are the peacemakers. So a couple of examples. Mark chapter 9, verse 33. This is when his guys were fighting with each other about who was the greatest. And Jesus resolved that and had peace in his relationship. Take a look at and read back how he did it. I do want to take and read John chapter 8, verse 1. I think this is a really fascinating interaction as a peacemaker of Jesus. Peacemaker of Jesus. I mean, Jesus being a peacemaker. Okay, we're very familiar with this passage, but I want to read it and make a couple of points here. Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. At dawn he appeared in the temple courts where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law of Moses, commanded us to stone such a woman, but what do you say?" They were using this question to trap him in order to have a basis of accusing him. You know, false motives always convolute everything. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger, and then when they kept questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Any of you who is without sin, let him be the first to throw a stone at her." Again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away at one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left, with the woman still standing there. And Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" He said, "No one, sir." She said, "No one." And then neither do I condemn you, Jesus declared. Now go and leave your life of sin. You know, a lot of times we read this and we get caught up on what he wrote on the ground. I mean, that's going to be a good question for down the road. But I think the thing that's really interesting about this situation is they brought this woman to him, and the opinion of the mob, the crowd at that point in time, is she should be stoned. And they wanted his go-ahead. But what did he do? He brought the question that he asked is, if any one of you who have sinned, you know, you be the first, have not sinned, you be the first one to throw the stone. And so he took this back to a personal decision for each one of those individuals about their personal righteousness. And interestingly enough, when this was all done, the opinion of each individual man was different than the opinion of the mob. Each one of them decided not to throw the stone because he personalized it. He brought it back, and he created peace in this relationship by helping people deal with their own hearts from a humility standpoint. People who do this are going to be known as sons of God. They're going to be known as peacemakers. And it is a masterful resolution. You know, they walked away. It created peace. You do this kind of thing, you're going to be called a son of God as well. Disagreements and differing opinions really don't cause the discord. A lot of times it really comes from the expectations on other people to comply with my opinion and forcing people from a position of power into compliance, authority, and exerting that over other men. A lot of times that's the root of it. And where did this all come from? They're trying to trap Jesus. That's where it all comes from. So when we begin to compare ourselves with other people, or we get caught up on who's better, or where am I as compared to other people, what kind of authority do I have versus somebody else have, that's a trap. We got to stay away from that stuff. It's back to the pure in heart, but then also being a peacemaker. Okay. Next one. Matthew chapter 5, verse 10 says, "Blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." I believe this to just be a simple validation. If we really want the approval of men, we're going to struggle with this one. When other people insult us, what do we want? We want people to like us, right? We would like that. It's not always going to happen. So an example is in John chapter 12, verse 42 and 43. And I'll read it. It says, "Yet at the same time many among the leaders believed in him. But because of the Pharisees, they wouldn't openly acknowledge their faith for fear that they would be put out of the synagogue, for they loved praise from men more than they loved praise from God." And Jesus specifically said that to the Pharisees. You love praise from men more than you love praise from God. And that was the root of their problem. Do we love praise from men more than we love praise from God? The kingdom of heaven belongs to the people who want it most. And they desire and wish for our Father's approval more than anything else. It means more to us. What God's estimation of us, God's opinion of us, how God feels about us as his child, as somebody who's forgiven, somebody that he's called, who has responded to him. It's got to mean more to us than what any other individual's opinion is. And so, if that's the case, you just got to ask yourself, what do you most want? Like, if you feel yourself being frustrated, what do you most want? Is God's estimation of you, is God's opinion of you, is that really what you most want and what you most value? Is it mean so much more to you than what? So this guy doesn't like you and is insulting you and is saying all kinds of negative things about you. Does that overshadow this, or does this overshadow that? This needs to be more important. This needs to be more valuable to us than the opinions of men. And if that's the case, then our own personal self-worth is not going to be threatened. The abuse that other people put on us does not threaten who we are. It doesn't threaten our self-worth. It doesn't bring our well-being into question. It doesn't impact our self-image in the eyes of God at all. And you'll see that in Jesus quite a bit. As kind of an aside, you look through there's a couple of times in the Scripture specifically he says, "I don't accept praise from men." He says, "I do not accept praise from men." And another place he says, "I don't entrust myself to a man because he knew what was in a man." So there were times where they were heaping praise on him, and he says, "You know that I do not accept praise from men. But I am the Lord." He's going on to validate something. But he makes that comment, "I don't accept praise from men." Do we accept praise from men? And I'm not saying that somebody gives you a compliment. Oh, no. That's not what I'm talking about. That's a lot of times a false humility, but but I think we need. Do we value the opinion of other men more? That's the main point. I don't need to belabor it anymore, but really consider it. I think sometimes when we start feeling insecure, frustrated, fearful, we got to go back and say, hey, what means the most to me? And then these insults, how else will you be able to rejoice when you're suffering? And you see all this other stuff around you. If you're standing here in a position of strength and you've got all this accusation around you, it's really just going to validate that your life of light is threatening somebody else, and it does not really change who you are. And that, hey, this is just validation that you're on the right path. I think that's really what he's getting at. James refers to this. Let us rejoice when we face trials of many kinds, because we know that the testing of our faith and so on and so forth. He says, hey, there's so much more on the other side of this. That's how I can rejoice when I go through suffering. But it really can only be there if our self-worth and our identity is tied into what God feels about us. So we recognize it for what it is, and then we can rejoice and be glad when it happens. It's not that we love abuse, but we see it for what it is. It's other people's, many times, feeble attempts of insecure people to avoid the truth about their own lives, and the fear that the light that we're supposed to bring into this world reveals about themselves. So the Beatitudes are mindsets, right? What are the mindsets that we have? If we have these kind of mindsets, it lays the foundation for a lot of the rest of the teaching that he does through the Sermon on the Mount and how he lived that on out in the rest of his gospel on earth. They're not intended to, again, goes back to that beginning. Does this, are these saying that we're worthless and we should be horrible and all this kind of stuff? It's not meant to have us an attitude of worthlessness or an obligation to acquiesce to everybody else's opinions or have some sort of poor self-image or self-emulation. It's not supposed to be that. It's meant instead to reinforce our value to God and the value of God to us and our value to other people. And those things are a wholesome attitude to have, and they also bless others and ourselves as well. So that's essentially a lesson for this morning. We do want to leave a little bit of time, any comments or whatever, and invite Mark and Brad and everybody else to questions or comments or whatever. So, yeah. So I would, again, this is one man's opinion. Again, you guys need to go back and study the scriptures and ask for the Spirit's guidance in you. But my take on that is poor in spirit. God's intention is for us to be rich in the Spirit, be filled with the Spirit, right? So why does he say something different? I don't think that's the point. I think if you take a look at your relationship with God, you take a look at, okay, how are you going to be when you're in heaven standing before the Father? How filled will you be at that point compared to right now? And if you see that there's a big gap, what do you want more than anything else? You want to be rich in the Spirit. You want to be filled with the Spirit. And it creates a desire to seek God versus a self-sufficiency that I don't need God. That's where we get tripped up. When we start thinking that we don't really need God, we are deceived. We're drastically deceived. We're not even close to where we will need to be. We're not going to be good enough. That was the struggle of the Jews, is that they took the law to mean that these are all the things that I'm going to be good enough. Listen, people, we're not good enough. You're never going to be good enough. You're not going to ever deserve heaven. We won't. We've just got to be able to recognize that and know that if it's not for the love of God and his mercy and grace to us, and the relationship is the main point, when we have that relationship, he overlooks a lot and he forgives a lot, right? Yeah, I think that's a really great point, and I think it's really unfortunate that we have to be in a situation that God puts us in a really struggling time to provide that reality and clarity that God is in control. Like, oh, can't we live that way all the time, right? But that is a lot of times when we really realize what God's doing in our lives and how powerful He is, and we have that desire to really seek Him. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Al? Well, I would say yes on the notes. I can certainly email those out to you, or anybody else that wants. Just let me know. Um, but I'd say as far as Epiphany, I mean, to be honest, this is kind of a journey I've been on for a while. Just in going back and studying just the Gospels, and I don't know if this is the best place to start, but I felt a lot of times I'd hear things that were being taught or things that I'd always taught, the paradigms that I once was in. And I'd walk away from those things reading in the scriptures saying, well, I'm a blessed, forgiven child of God who should be able to approach the throne of grace with confidence, brother of Jesus, higher even than the angels. Why do I feel bad about myself? And I was struggling with that. And I decided, I don't want to know what anybody else has to say. I don't want to read any other books. Matter of fact, I don't even want to know what Paul, John, Peter, anybody else has to say. I'm just going to read the Gospels. And I spent the last 2 years just going through, just reading word for word. It took about 2 years to get through all 4 of the Gospels and just reading it. What does it say? And there were epiphanies that came out of that. There were things that I think I'd kind of adopted or been taught over the years. And I'm like, you know what? Jesus did not really teach that. He did not really teach that. And as I began to look at that, it began to resolve a lot of those dissonance things. That's like, this violates my conscience. This is not right. So I think we got to be really connected with the man. And secondly, the other epiphany that came out of there is I became really impressed with who Jesus was. And I really believe that there's a gap in our movement and probably in Western society that people are just not as impressed with the man as they were back then. I mean, you see people do incredible acts of boldness and faith because they saw the man, they were so inspired by him. We need that desperately. And so that was kind of where that came from, yeah. Mm-hmm. We're about on time, just briefly. Yeah, I can share the notes with you, and you can just go ahead and study it yourself, yeah. Go ahead, yep. Homework is, I'd like you to think through how the Beatitudes are all connected. All right. Yep, thanks, guys.